You're being sold a lie. Every time a politician or activist promises you the moon and the sun on the climate change debate, understand that they're appealing to your sense of virtue with no real policy to back it up. And there's hardly anyone today doing a better job at exposing that than Jordan Peterson, which is why this conversation with Bjorn Lomberg is only becoming more relevant as the years pass.
We are all confronted with a constant story about the catastrophe that faces the planet, particularly on the carbon front. It is simpler and, in some sense, more immediately morally rewarding to reduce the complexity of planetary management to the need to reduce our so-called carbon footprint. But the plain truth of the matter is that a multitude of troubles beset us, both economically and environmentally. How those who hypothetically lead us are failing to save the planet at this year's UN climate change conference, known as COP27. Why 27? Because this is literally the 27th time that such a group has been convened. And as you will soon see or hear, very little has been accomplished and much time and money wasted in consequence. Global carbon dioxide emissions have kept increasing since the world's nations first committed to rein in climate change at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. Despite dozens of climate summits and the global climate agreements struck in Kyoto and Paris, this is the case once again in 2022, when we will collectively set a new emissions record, while rich countries increasingly promise draconian cuts and then generally backtrack as they import huge amounts of oil, gas, and coal to save their citizens from energy poverty, as they have done most recently to address the current energy crisis. Most of the future emissions will come from the currently poorer countries in Asia and Africa, as they power their climb out of abject poverty.
And you know what's most hypocritical about that? The fact is, the modern environmentalist movement that basically demands that countries trade in growth and cost effectiveness for lower carbon emissions is actually more elitist than it appears. For countries and populations in the third world trying to escape the abyss of poverty, cheap energy is absolutely indispensable. And when you have first world nations that have already graduated to the point of affording renewable energy, demanding that other countries skip that growth phase entirely, you then start to realize how these nice-sounding climate mitigation policies only do more to solidify the poor in their place than lift them up. Take, for example, one simple graph. In that fraction of the world map, there's 3 things to bear in mind. Over half the world's population lives here. This area is the world's largest carbon emitter, and the fact that it has one of the fastest rates of the population rapidly rising out of abject poverty. A vast majority of that is fueled by cheap energy from non-renewable sources, and you can be sure that no average poor family in that area would trade in their food and energy security to feel good about cutting down on their carbon footprints. And by the way, for anyone with a rosy picture of how it all pans out, these climate change summits, policies, and international agreements incentivize the governments that are part of them to meet those mitigation targets. If you think that for the few countries that make progress on it, there isn't a large economic and human cost, you probably haven't taken a deeper look at the country like Germany or the Netherlands. On the broader subject of climate change, these are 2 countries that serve as a vivid example of the cost they've paid in shifting to renewable energy for the former and then curbing nitrogen emissions for the latter. But before I get into that, I want you to watch Bjorn Lomberg reveal just how much, or how little, has actually been achieved on the climate front as admitted by the UN itself, leaving countries that tried to trade growth and prosperity for the climate fight alone to bear the cost.
In the previous 10 years, the world has focused more on remediating climate change than ever before. Despite this, we're not achieving anything, although no shortage of money has been wasted. In a surprisingly honest review of climate policies, the UN revealed a lost decade. The report found that it couldn't tell the difference between what has happened and a world that adopted no new climate policies since 2005. Consider that. All those climate summits and grandiose promises, all that expense and trouble, and no measurable difference whatsoever. This state of affairs is unsurprising, unfortunately, because today's renewable energy sources have 2 big problems. First, they occupy a vast amount of space, often displacing nature. Replacing a square yard of gas-fired power plant requires 73 square yards of solar panels, 239 square yards of onshore wind turbines, or an astonishing 6,000 square yards of biomass. One study found that the United States would have to devote a land area 4 times the size of the United Kingdom to clean power to fulfill President Biden's promise of a carbon-free economy by 2050. Second, and of even greater importance, the 2 renewable energy technologies favored by the vast majority of environmental activists are intermittent or unreliable. Solar energy simply isn't produced when it's overcast or nighttime. Wind energy requires a breeze. We're often told by green energy boosters that wind and solar energy are cheaper than fossil fuels. At best, that is only true when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. On a windless, dark night, the cost of wind and solar power rises to the infinite.
And that is the blunt truth on carbon mitigation that gets you laughed out of the room as a climate change denier. In that lost decade, as the UN calls it, there should be more than ample reason now, clear, to make a course correction. Take, for example, an economy like Germany, which arguably has made the greatest shift to renewable energy sources in all of Europe, with vast wind farms and solar parks. In the wake of incidents like the Nord Stream pipeline being blown up and the harsh winter of Western Europe, the country quickly saw a massive spike in their energy prices that quickly made the nation have to turn back on its fossil fuel energy plants, and it happened out of sheer necessity in abeyance of its strict climate summit goals and promises. When it finally came to it, energy security, efficiency, and the economy trumped everything else, and it gave the country a closer look at a similar choice that many other poorer nations in the world have to face. It wasn't even very long, just next year, that we saw another country realize something similar, but more contained in the premises of its own boundaries. The Dutch farmer protests in 2023 saw tens of thousands of farmers who decided that they'd had enough. That's because they, at the bottom of the food supply chain, were the ones being economically crushed with emission mitigation challenges by being forced to downsize their farms and herds into practical bankruptcy. It was one case that woke people up to who would really be paying the price at the end of the day for all that lost growth. Contrary to what people might think, most governments don't really have the will or ability to go after the strong industrial sector that pollutes the most while making sure the weak farmer or worker faces the least brunt. It's a difficult balancing act that government and officials would rather just put off to the side to try and meet goals that make them look good. That's what someone like Jordan Peterson understands as well, because no international regulator or government official is immune to the incompetence, greed, and indifference that we should come to expect from them.
It is for such reasons that it is deeply misleading, although highly convenient, to compare the energy costs of wind or solar to fossil fuels only when it is windy or sunny. It is also important to note that since all solar energy is sold at essentially the same time, when the sun is up and shining, its value drops dramatically. When solar reaches 30% market share in California, for example, as one study revealed, it loses 2/3 of its value.
Furthermore, because modern societies require 24 hours of non-stop power, backup is not optional. And that means reliance on fossil fuels when there's no sun or wind. As more sun and wind is introduced, more fossil fuel backups become ever more expensive as they offer their services for fewer hours to produce the necessary return on capital. And what are batteries? Globally, we have battery storage with current capacity to store 1 minute and 15 seconds of the world's electricity consumption. And that problem will not be ameliorated soon. Even by 2030, global batteries will only cover less than 11 minutes of the global electricity consumption.
And all of this just shows the problems with moving electricity away from fossil fuel. When Biden promises ambitiously that all of America's electricity will come from renewable sources by 2035, he is addressing the comparatively simple part of the climate challenge. Electricity constitutes just 19% of total energy use. We're far further behind in developing solutions for agriculture, manufacturing, construction, and transportation. Of these, the latter, transportation, is most often discussed by environmentalists and virtue-signaling politicians who insist that the solution is already at hand. electric vehicles. Despite massive subsidies, however, just 1.4% of cars globally are electric, and that number is not rising quickly.
All of that points to just one thing. Most people that virtue signal, lecture, and make promises on climate change seldom have any idea of what they're talking about. More often than not, people that think they can tinker and tweak entire national economies to make them even more efficient often just resemble a monkey with a wrench. It's likely to cause more damage than make 100 tiny improvements. Apply this to your life too, because any politician that promises you a goal without a step-by-step roadmap of how to get there is often just looking for your vote. And on the issue of climate change, the idea that entire economies powered by fossil fuels and non-renewable energy sources can just flick the switch to clean renewable energy in a few short years just sounds too good to be true. It's evident in something like the rise of electric vehicles, where we see the pollution and mining of vital lithium simply outsourced to poorer countries so rich people can feel good about themselves saving the environment. Seeing how Jordan Peterson and Bjorn Lomberg put a pin in that bubble, it makes you realize what's really going on, should at least teach you to question wholesale narratives on an issue as broad and complex as climate change.